It's not like, hey, freedom to come up with any idea you want hasn't produced a whole lot of carnage. But the question is, over time, does it produce more open, fairer, more decent societies? And I believe that it does.
Freedom of speech, absolute freedom of speech can be quite destructive. But you nevertheless have to hold on to that, because in the long term, I think you and I guess, are optimistic in the sense that good ideas will win out.
I'm not a doctor. I'm a fucking moron. And I'm a cage fighting commentator who's a dirty stand-up comedian who just told you I'm drunk most of the time. And I do testosterone and I smoke a lot of weed. But I'm not a respected source of information, even for me. If I say things, I'm always going, check on that, Jamie. I don't know if that's true.
Heretics actually are an interesting group. And the thing that unites them seems to be their independence of the structures that are controlling others.
I got through the fucking net and I'm swimming in open waters, okay? And that's just how I live.
Yeah.
I don't, like, if you say you disagree with me, I probably disagree with me too. I disagree with me all the time. If someone said, you have, young, healthy, 21-year-old people who eat well and exercise are not at high risk for coronavirus, but you should think about other people, I would say, well, that's a different argument, and yes, that makes sense. But I would say, aren't those people vaccinated? And shouldn't we vaccinate the vulnerable people?
What do you make of it when the people who are free, who don't have to answer to their department chair, right, are saying one thing, and the people who are signed up for some system that holds their well-being in its hands are saying the other thing, right? And in this case, YouTube is playing this weird role, right? I'm free. I can talk about scientific evidence. But in order to talk about it with my audience, I have to go through YouTube, right? So YouTube is playing like it's my department chair, and it wants me to shut up about certain topics, and it's going to turn up the heat on me until I do.
Before we talk about the various vaccines for COVID-19, I'd like to talk to you about censorship. So given everything you're saying, why did YouTube and other places censor discussion of ivermectin?
Well, there's a question about why they say they did it, and there's a question about why they actually did it. Now, it is worth mentioning that YouTube is part of a consortium. It is partnered with Twitter, Facebook, Reuters, AP, Financial Times, Washington Post, some other notable organizations, and that this group has appointed itself the arbiter of truth.
It's a hard problem to solve in terms of a response, and it's easy to see how people get freaked out by the authoritarian implications of having these virtually monopolistic companies close down conversation on specific topics. But it's
absolutely,
it's a nightmare what's happening in terms of how friction-free the spread of misinformation has become.
There's a lot of censorship around ivermectin, and it's really to get this positive message out to the public as quickly and efficiently as possible that COVID is treatable, not to be feared. There's a whole range of generic medicines and supplements that can and should be used, and ivermectin is top of the list. It was established by a group of UK doctors, but it included many, many doctors from around the world and allied health professionals and scientists. And at that meeting, it was decided that the evidence was judged to be sufficient for ivermectin to be recommended for both prevention and treatment of COVID.
These things are being handed down from on high. And then they are silencing the people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, that thing you just told me from on high doesn't square with all the stuff I can see, right? So they are shutting down the challenge to a consensus that has no right to be labeled as scientific, because it isn't. It didn't arise through the normal process. It isn't what most people think. It is an official position, right? That is not a scientific consensus.
So this is a quick update to let everyone know that YouTube just took down our film from a week ago, ivermectin for and against, which is really quite concerning.
Simultaneously, easily demonstrated and seemingly invisible campaign of censorship that is currently being faced by the most prominent scientists advancing the case for ivermectin. So the COVID Critical Care Twitter account has been suspended for something like a week. Why does Twitter think it gets a vote as to whether or not doctors prescribe ivermectin to their sick patients, or whether we get to talk about what the evidence actually says? Why does Twitter get a vote? We can have discussions about whether or not it is the best approach, and we can talk about how we might value the various hazards and assets of the different treatments. We can talk about how they might be combined. But the idea that we are having to battle with our hands tied behind our back over whether or not there is even evidence that it works, when there is obviously evidence that it clearly works and is safe, is amazing. That is the result of a censorship campaign, and it is happening under our noses. We should be absolutely livid.
Bret and everyone who's listening to him are incredibly animated by their clumsy efforts at censorship, because they can always point to the instance where what they censored was, actually is now CDC policy, right? At one point CDC was against mask wearing, right? And if you, what are you going to censor the people who said we should have been wearing masks a year ago? It was just obvious we should have been wearing masks. It's a hard problem to solve in terms of a response, and it's easy to see how people get freaked out by the authoritarian implications of having these virtually monopolistic companies close down conversation on specific topics.
What about the COVID turnaround from Facebook now? That COVID skepticism in terms of the origin of it. Have you had a look at this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're dropping their. This is, I think, going to be very revelatory to very many people. Hopefully, and I pray every day to Loki that this is going to make some people realize how duplicitous the overlords are.
Why?
Well, because, to come in with global pandemic, you're coming in, you're asking, we're going to shut down the earth. You were going to shut down any discussion about certain aspects of this. Like, you should, if you question it, we're just going to lose your social media account, which is something very necessary for very many people, obviously. And now to be like, oh, yeah, maybe we were wrong.
A large group of people who believe that they have suffered negative consequences was removed from Facebook. So there's very clearly an effort to
200,000 users just wiped off the planet. Right.
But the other problem is in the United States, which is far worse than any other place that I know of in the world, we have a very significant proportion of these anti-vaxxers, conspiracy theorists, anti-science. I mean, this started, of course, before the pandemic, but it's been, gone much higher levels. So we are not reaping the advantages and the protection here that we could.
In effect, they have decided to control discussion ostensibly to prevent the distribution of misinformation. Mm-hmm. Now, how have they chosen to do that? In this case, they have chosen to simply utilize the recommendations of the WHO and the CDC and apply them as if they are synonymous with scientific truth.
And this is coupled to a pervasive distrust in institutions now. I mean, people distrust the government, they distrust the media, they distrust science and scientists. Our medical journals have lost standing. Certainly organizations like the CDC and the WHO have fairly immolated their reputations over the last 18 months or so. And some of this is understandable. I mean, there really has been some terrible failures of public health messaging and instances of hypocrisy and doublethink.
Even at their best, the WHO and CDC are not scientific entities. They are entities that are about public health. And public health has this, whether it's right or not, and I believe I disagree with it, but it has this self-assigned right to lie that comes from the fact that there is game theory that works against, for example, a successful vaccination campaign. That if everybody else takes a vaccine and therefore the herd becomes immune through vaccination, and you decide not to take a vaccine, then you benefit from the immunity of the herd without having taken the risk. So people who do best are the people who opt out. That's a hazard, And the WHO and CDC as public health entities effectively oversimplify stories in order that game theory does not cause a predictable tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, well, so there's a conspiratorial frame of mind here, which is given just enough Pavlovian reinforcement to be almost impossible for people to break out of, because there are occasional conspiracies. There are certainly bad incentives that can be detected.
With that said, once that right to lie exists, then it turns out to serve the interests of, for example, pharmaceutical companies, which have emergency use authorizations that require that there not be a safe and effective treatment and have immunity from liability for harms caused by their product. So that's a recipe for disaster.
So at MIT, colleagues of mine, people I know, there's a slight pressure to not be allowed to, one, speak publicly, and two, actually think. Like, to even think about these ideas. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but just to, in the privacy of your own home, to read things, to think. It's many people, many world-class biologists that I know will just avoid looking at the data. There's not even that many people that are publicly opposing gain-of-function research. They're also like, it's not worth it.
There is a different problem within the sciences. It's been brewing for longer. It's about the economic model of how scientists scientists are funded and how institutions are funded by those scientists, therefore providing perverse incentives for scientists to only do big science, expensive science.
It's just people are self-censoring and silencing themselves and silencing the most important thing, which is the power of their brains. Like, these people are brilliant. And the fact that they're not utilizing their brain to come up with solutions outside of the conformist line of thinking is tragic.
Well, it is. I also think that we have to look at it and understand it for what it is. For one thing, it's kind of a cryptic totalitarianism. Somehow, people's sense of what they're allowed to think about, talk about, discuss is causing them to self-censor. And I can tell you it's causing many of them to rationalize, which is even worse.
Yeah, you add to that paranoia the belief that any emphasis on vaccination rather than treatment of COVID with existing compounds like ivermectin, that's based on a pure profit motive coming from big pharma and the mercenary manipulation of government, right? We're all doing the bidding somehow of Pfizer and Moderna.
Right.
I got you, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, even you, AstraZeneca.
Moderna, I got the vaccine up inside my Pfizer. Moderna, I got the vaccine.
I mean, so I can say, for instance, someone's going to think that of us in this conversation. I mean, it should go without saying that I have absolutely no entanglement with big pharma, and
same for me.
There's no pressure on me to do a podcast about the benefits of vaccines. So it's this is just a pure PSA from my point of view.
They're telling us a conclusion. To the extent that we can check their conclusion, it doesn't add up. To the extent we can check their perverse incentives, they're all over the place. So, at what point do we get to ask the question?
And also, just to close the loop on Bret's concern here, it's not just that the big tech companies are doing it, but there really is a conspiracy that's happening out in the open where you have the government asking the big tech companies to do this.
Right.
It's not that no one ever conspires. Even in this case, they even admit that they're conspiring.
Yeah. Look at this quote. Biden's allied groups, including the Democratic National Committee, are also planning to engage fact checkers more aggressively and work with SMS carriers to dispel misinformation about vaccines that is sent over social media and text messages. The goal is to ensure that people who have difficulty getting a vaccination because of issues like transportation see those barriers lessened or removed entirely. What does that mean? What? Dispel misinformation.
This is
text.
Orwellian.
Yeah.
That's it.
I've heard this many times, actually, on the inside of YouTube and with colleagues that I've talked with, is they kind of, in a very casual way, say their job is simply to slow or prevent the spread of misinformation. And they say it like that's an easy thing to do. Like, to know what is true or not is an easy thing to do. And so from the YouTube perspective, I think they basically outsource of the task of knowing what is true or not to public institutions that on a basic Google search claim to be the arbiters of truth.
And now Biden's like, come on, man, I'll censor your text messages. And where's like the pitchforks?
I don't know. This is quiet. It's happening quietly. Part of the problem, I didn't see it on MSNBC yet. Maybe Rachel Maddow will pick it up.
This is a whole new level of beyond.
You know, a big problem with this that is showing its head to me is that a year ago, well, even like 6 months ago, talking about the lab leak hypothesis was considered misinformation and would have been censored. So I don't know what's going to not be considered misinformation in the future that's considered misinformation right now that would cause people to have their entire phone history censored.
The president will outline 5 areas his team is focused on to get more Americans vaccinated. 1, targeted community by community door-to-door outreach to get remaining Americans vaccinated by ensuring they have the information they need on how both safe and accessible the vaccine is.
I believe it's a Joe and company to make me disappointed that the knock at my door isn't the Jehovah's Witnesses. But beyond how twisted this sort of weird evangelism is, there's a subtle premise in Psaki's language that's crucial to understand. She says remaining Americans will get vaccinated when they have the information that they need, as though the only reason the unjabbed remain unjabbed is that they haven't yet heard of her Lord and Savior, Dr. Fauci. They have. In every hour of every day for months. They have the information. It's almost impossible to hide from the information these days.
The reason why I'm excited, and I know a lot of people are excited about your being here, is that you fall under the category of what we call as a trusted messenger. You and I are living through one of the most extraordinary pandemics in history. None that we've ever seen like this in the last 100 years. That's why it's important to get vaccinated.
Good to know.
They just made a decision that's different from the one that you want them to. A lot of questions have to be inferred from Psaki's commentary. Is it really the government's role to monitor my medical decisions? And are they already doing that? How do they know which doors to knock on? Are they maintaining a list? And if the White House believes in free choice, why are they so dead set on everyone making one choice?
I wonder if you can answer that criticism. It's none of the government's business knowing who has or hasn't been vaccinated. What do you say?
Perhaps we should point out that the federal government has had to spend trillions of dollars to try to keep Americans alive during this pandemic. So it is absolutely the government's business. It is taxpayers' business if we have to continue to spend money to try to keep people from contracting COVID and helping reopen the economy.
Well, here's another option. Stop taking our money and stop interfering with our ability to make it. We don't need you to take our money to get permission to make more of it to provide for ourselves. He's talking like the money he spends is his. We invested trillions. No, you didn't. You took trillions. We invested in you.
We want to give people a sense that they have the freedom to choose, but we hope they choose to live.
Okay, we don't have the sense of rights. We have rights, and you don't give them to us. They're ours by nature. It is shocking how philosophically twisted one sentence can be. Our right is to actually be free, and that right is inherent to our humanity. It's not granted by or subject to his manipulation. And that's not just a founding principle of American governance. That's a founding principle of morality. Deception and illusion are not substitutes for justice. The sense of justice is not what matters. Only justice does. And the same goes for your freedom. The sense of your freedom holds no inherent value. Only your actual freedom does. And anybody who tells you otherwise is exactly the sort of person who would come to your door and try to coerce you into living a life according to their direction, because they don't actually value your freedom and your rights first. Freedom and rights aren't inherent goods to these people. They're simply tools to use toward their ends. So I don't see concern about these statements as exaggerated or alarmist at all. I think Jen and Jorge's comments are indicative of a philosophical distortion that will prove itself more threatening over time. When you don't build the foundation correctly, the house is doomed to crumble. So it would be wise to Pay attention to those cracks.
The founders, the American founders, settled on a counterintuitive formulation that people should be free to say anything. They should be free from the government blocking them from doing so. They did not imagine that in formulating that right, that most of what was said would be of high quality, nor did they imagine it would be free of harmful things. What they correctly reasoned was that the benefit of leaving everything so it can be said exceeds the cost, which everyone understands to be substantial. What I would say is they could not have anticipated the impact, the centrality of platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. If they had, they would not have limited the First Amendment as they did. They clearly understood that the power of the federal government was so great that it needed to be limited by granting explicitly the right of citizens to say anything. In fact, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook may be more powerful in this moment than the federal government of their worst nightmares could have been.
Why not push for vaccine mandates in states, private companies, schools? Do you want to see those entities pass vaccine mandates?
I had asked the Justice Department to determine whether they're able to do that legally. And they can. Local communities can do that. Local businesses can do that. It's still a question whether the federal government can mandate the whole country. I don't know that yet.
Instead of looking for ways he can maximize consent, he's looking for ways to circumvent it. He's looking for technicalities in the law, not the broad philosophical spirit that is the basis of the law. And a CDC director is saying much the same thing. Perhaps vaccine passports are the path forward.
But they're issuing health passes there, right? Where, you can go to a disco, or a discotheque as they like to call it there, if you have a health pass. Is that something that the CDC would ever lean into or perhaps advise here?
I think some communities are doing that, and that may very well be a path forward.
What do you think we should do around requiring vaccination in the public or private sector in various contexts? So, mandates in schools or hospitals or businesses or for travel. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's really tied in, Sam, to the question you just asked about the full approval, because general counsel of our health system, and if you talk to private large companies, municipalities, even though there have been some that have said, like, for example, at the University of California, you have to be vaccinated or you can't come on campus. You can't be a student, you can't be on the faculty. But that's the rarity right now. The day that we get full approval, which should have happened by now, all these things open up and there will be a requirement for vaccination, or there'll be accommodations for those who don't want to get vaccinated. You have to wear a mask at all times at work, and you have to get tested on a frequent basis. And I would submit to you that the people that opt for the non-vaccination after a couple of weeks, they're not going to want to go through all that, and they'll go ahead and get vaccinated. So I actually think tens of millions of Americans, soon after full approval, will be required to be vaccinated or will be given an option that is unpalatable.
I think that Democrats should be really cautious to want to go back to mandates that vaccinated people feel like are punishing them. And I think that these types of rules in the free market, these types of nudges is a better path forward, politically speaking. Obviously, if we get to the point where you have to do mandates and nudges, that's where you are. But I just think that the Democrats should look to that first and think, we're the responsible party. We're trying to encourage people to be responsible. We're not punishing people who are being responsible.
I'll tell you this much, though, okay? The longer this country, the longer our planet is crippled by ongoing plague that we have the ability to deal with but choose not to because of political pressures, the more our fight against conservatism stops being a matter of political difference and starts being a fight for the survival of the human race.
We've got to shake people at this point and say, come on now. We tried voluntary. We could not have been more kind and compassionate as a country. Free testing everywhere you turn, incentives, friendly, warm embrace. The voluntary phase is over. We can keep doing those things. I'm not saying shut it down. I'm saying voluntary alone doesn't work. It's time for mandates because it's the only way to protect our people.
Well, first of all, that needs to be an official Democratic Party slogan. What a great bumper sticker. Democrats, the voluntary phase is over. Make this guy the party chair. Consent is not a phase. Consent is the foundational basis for a just government. But as shocking as that moral twisting is, we're all supposed to be shocked, apparently, that his kind and generous gestures like this insufferable burger stunt were unsuccessful in persuading you.
If this is appealing to you, just think of this when you think of vaccination. Vaccination. I'm getting a very good feeling about vaccination right this moment.
If you want it, you can get it. At this point, they're basically throwing them away, trying to find everybody out there who will take it. People have had plenty of opportunity, and it's a free country. Many people decided that they don't want it and will take the risk. It's okay, fine. You know, I'm not even denigrating that decision. I'm saying you can live with the consequences of that. But what's happened is that this panic is obscuring a lot and being used to bring back mask mandates in violation of CDC guidance, possibly previewing future lockdowns. It's also being framed very much as a right-wing thing.
Obviously, there have been wildly irresponsible pundits and commentators on Fox and other conservative news outlets. Obviously, the Republican candidates were too late to setting a good message. This all has been, kind of really set in stone for a year now, right? If you thought COVID was a hoax last year, why would you get an experimental shot this year?
One of the scariest things about the Wuhan coronavirus, one of the many reasons all of us have long been so afraid of it, has always been how little we know about it. Ebola, malaria, cholera, obviously those are dangerous diseases. They've killed millions. But on the whole, we understand them pretty well, the fundamentals anyway. We know how easily they spread. We know how deadly they are. This disease, by contrast, is entirely new. It's literally a novel coronavirus. Early accounts said the mystery illness coming from central China could be transmitted far more easily than the flu, and that the death rate was remarkably high. Some reports suggested it could kill 2, 3, 5, even 8% of all those who got it. Worst case scenarios predicted millions and millions of people would die. The public was horrified. They still are. But how afraid should they be? Many people are still dying in this pandemic, including here in the United States. Beyond that fact, we still don't have the numbers we need to fully understand what's happening around us. Too few people have been tested.
And the Delta variant has tipped us into a condition where even those of us who are vaccinated can no longer enjoy the light at the end of the tunnel because we have been pushed back into that tunnel by, frankly, the confusion of our neighbors.
My mind is blown. Everybody's so excited. People keep saying it's going to be the most turnt summer ever. And yet here we are facing another potential shutdown. I mean, do you think that the country at this point will have a shutdown in October? Or will we just get used to nearly 1,000 people dying every day?
And, I have to say, I was really looking forward to this summer, this time of year, because I thought, we could get right back to pre-COVID life. I could stop having to put my attention on COVID and get it back to the things that I much more enjoy.
It really could be terminal to the Biden administration if there isn't this sense of the entire promise of his presidency was a return to normal. I mean, that's really the only thing that he campaigned on and really promised. And so if we're still living in lockdowns, if we're still living in these aggressive pandemic era restrictions, that is a true, failure in terms of his most basic promise that he offered. And I think that my guess, because they have been politically savvy in certain instances, is that they see that as a real threat. That's part of why they're freaking out about Facebook and trying to make that the nexus of why there's hesitancy, so that they can blame it on Facebook, misinformation, Fox News, conservatives, right wing, whatever, versus having any accountability themselves. So I think that's their push is going to be.
I think you're totally right.
Eventually, caring for the unvaccinated will fall to the people who are vaccinated. How in the hell did saving yourself from a deadly virus become political?
This is every single U.S. county measured on 2 axes. How many adults there have been fully vaccinated, and how many of them voted for Trump? You might notice a pattern.
So Matt Stoller actually put this graph, let's put this up there. I found it absolutely great because it breaks all of the conventional narrative, which is that if you can see there in the graph here in terms of all 40 states, is that Black Americans are actually the lowest disproportionate number in order to be vaccinated, along with Hispanic Americans, then white Americans, then Asian Americans. So what we have there is that the least vaccinated group of Black Americans is the most Democratic leaning. And there's a big push right now online being like Fox News is lying to its viewers. Now look, have there been some pretty irresponsible segments on Fox News? Yeah. Yes, in my opinion, but there are 3 million. There's 3 million people who watch that show or who watch that program at the best of days. There are 100 million people who haven't been vaccinated.
Yeah.
You think they're all just watching Fox News?
And increasingly, I feel like, don't we all know that Democrats versus Republicans doesn't capture a rather large percentage of Americans? There are a whole lot of us. I mean, independents have always been a real thing and, a substantial minority. But I think increasingly what has happened in the last 5 years-ish, a ton of people have decided that they can't abide either of these parties anymore.
A lot of people, 100 million about approximately, have zero trust in our institutions. And that's a way bigger question that we have to solve here.
Yeah, there's actually a lot to say about this. And of course, that chart also tracks closely with income level.
Yep.
So, the lower you are on the income scale, the less likely you are to have been vaccinated. So basically, there is a direct correlation to how badly you've been fucked by both the medical establishment and American society writ large.
I'm glad that it is the people who are choosing not to get vaccinated who are more at risk than the people who are fastidious enough to get vaccinated.
For some people who are choosing not to get the vaccine, excessive fear of COVID is the primary cause of public health restrictions, and their refusal to take the vaccine is in some small way an attempt to model a life unruled by this fear.
In Scotland, researchers tested 500 people 3 weeks into the outbreak there. More than 1% tested positive for antibodies to coronavirus. That is 12 times greater than the confirmed caseload in that country at that time, 12 times more. In Denmark, a little over a month into the outbreak, only 0.1% of the population was infected, according to official numbers. And yet a screening of 1,500 people found that 2.7% actually had antibodies. That would mean the true death rate from coronavirus there might be 1/27th as high as they thought it was. Meanwhile, in Germany, the official death rate from the coronavirus stands today at about 2.5%. That's a horrifying number. And it may be real. On the other hand, in the town of Gangelt, where large-scale random testing has been performed, the death rate was found to be just 0.37%. That's a fraction of the official numbers, barely 1/7 of it. So all of this is very encouraging news. If the infection is more widespread than we thought, by definition, that means the virus is less deadly. That would mean our burden on the healthcare system would be lower than we expected it to be. And in fact, we are seeing that. It would also mean that coronavirus may be closer than we knew to running its course. It would mean an awful lot of people have already been infected with it and then recovered without even knowing it. And those people could pause and let relief sweep over them and then get back to their lives. Above all, if this is true, if these trends hold, it would mean that the rest of us could be slightly less terrified going forward. Yes, this is awful. Yes, people are dying. Yes, they will continue to die here in the U.S. But it would not quite be the plague we thought it was.
How do we penetrate that willful layer of ignorance of people who are saying, well, I'm just not going to do it because I don't want to?
There are people who are scared of the vaccine, and that is because they have been subjected to this overwhelming onslaught of propaganda, and I feel for them, but this is not the time to be sympathetic towards them. This is not their time for sympathy. This is not their victimhood. This is victimhood they're inflicting on other people.
And if you've never known actual oppression, you can somehow mistake having to wear a mask and having to get a vaccine as such, which is completely not the case. Why the resistance? I mean, this cannot all be Trump. People do have some humane instinct that you at least want to save yourself if you don't give a damn about anybody else.
Well, I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating about this pandemic is that it's happening during the time of social media, where we've never had anything like this before, where groupthink is encouraged and enforced, and people. There also, because of the pandemic, so many people are just online all day.
Sure.
Because they're unemployed or they're at work from home and they're not really working. They're just on Twitter all day. And you're seeing this, like, these really crazy behavior patterns. It's like people ganging up on people.
It's fine to bully them. It is fine. If you have people who don't want to get the vaccine, they are committing themselves to social stigma. And frankly, I think it's inconsiderate of you to deny them that reward.
I think, I had this tweet where was a huge backlash, and I said if you replace the term coronavirus with Jews, all of a sudden the behavior of 1930s Germany makes a lot more sense. Because one of the big questions back in the day is, how did Hitler pull this off? How did he convince a population of educated people to behave in just the most inhuman ways? And what we're seeing is when low status people are given an excuse to assert dominance over other people for whatever reason, illegitimate in that case, somewhat legitimate in this case, they will champ at the bit.
A public service announcement. I'm afraid that all of you are going to have to shut up and take it seriously because it's actually really, really, really important. I'm not joking. Vaccinations.
To tell you to sit down and shut up and obey.
That is true.
It decentralizes the enforcement mechanism. I was on the subway in New York. I've been in New York all my life. I've never seen anything like this, where an older man in his 50s was yelling at an Asian dude who wasn't like it's a rickshaw. He was just like a regular Asian dude standing over him, screaming, "Where's your mask? Go back where you came from." And it's like, if you're this concerned about the virus, why are you coming close to him? You don't care about the virus. This is your excuse to be dominant and aggressive over someone in the most despicable way possible.
Being unvaccinated because you don't want to take it should be an unreproachable blemish on your character that makes people around you disgusted by you, okay? Not, oh, this is a choice. Not, oh, peer pressure them until they're miserable. Because the solution to their misery is 20 minutes at a local CVS or wherever their local vaccine station is twice. That's it. If you have friends or family who won't get vaccinated, don't see them until they are, even if you're vaccinated. If you have kids and your grandparents won't get vaccinated, do not let them see your grandchildren until they get vaccinated. The vaccines are free. If you have friends or family who aren't getting vaccinated for some political reason because they think it'll do this and that's it, you can put them in the vice as hard as you want. Even if they bitch about it for the rest of their lives, they don't deserve any better.
We are not properly informed.
We are not properly informed, and we are also in a position where the pharmaceutical industry has corrupted government. It is teamed up with tech platforms, and everyone has decided for us that the risks that you and I know one has to be worried about because they are not negligible. Yeah. That those risks are overblown and that only bad people talk about them. It happens that they don't seem to like drugs that they don't stand to profit a great deal from. And so the point is, those drugs are not promising.
Yeah. What I don't think people recognize, people who have a conspiratorial style of explaining anomalies don't tend to recognize that their explanations don't actually run through. There's no plausible background set of incentives that could explain a given conspiracy coming together.
How many of these things would have to go in this direction where, okay, Bill Gates is an authority on vaccines. He really is. But he's also lying to us about the capacity to produce more of them if the patent structure was altered for the purpose of the pandemic.
They will not share vaccines. They will not share vaccine recipes. Life-saving drugs have been locked in patents. A senior official of the Biden administration was asked if America will relent. Will the United States back a patent waiver? Team Biden said it has nothing to share on this front. And it's not just governments, by the way, who are putting patents over lives. Even individuals who make up the global elite are championing the cause of Big Pharma. The likes of Bill Gates, the billionaire philanthropist, believes vaccine formula should not be shared with the developing world. He gave the statement on Sunday. Bill Gates was asked if it would be helpful for intellectual property protections to be lifted. How did he respond? With an emphatic note, the United States has 550 million extra vaccines. That's what you call hoarding.
Had we been able to get vaccines widely distributed throughout the world, potent vaccines throughout the world early on, the pandemic would essentially be over now. The problem is, though, we aren't able to make the vaccines for 7+ billion people, right?
Countries like the US and the UK represent the global elite, the rich who booked millions of doses well in advance. Now they have extra vaccines, enough to inoculate their population 3 times over, in some cases 5 times, but they haven't shared anything with the world. And they're making sure this system does not change.
Okay, that's interesting. Fauci, who has demonstrated a willingness to lie to us about masks and has also demonstrated rotten judgment with respect to gain-of-function research, is now telling us, and in the clip, I didn't show you the Fauci clip, but he talks about the fact that we're going to need to vaccinate children. Well, there are reasons you wouldn't want to, even if this vaccine thing was safe enough for us adults. There are multiple reasons why, as the risk of serious COVID drops off with kids, you might want to exclude them.
But when essentially what you had was people who knew more than the PolitiFact and the fact-checking organizations and Facebook and Twitter and such like, people were penalized for holding what now is actually considered to be a plausible, if not a realistic view.
And let's also talk about nuance. Let's suppose, okay, it's completely ridiculously and absurd and nonsensical that COVID was made in a lab in China. That might be factually true. But what is truthful is that governments, and I'm not saying this would happen in Antarctica, I'm just saying entities, are currently trying to bioengineer viruses.
One thing that rests on this question is whether we continue to do this kind of research going forward. And the scientists in question, all of them, American, Chinese, all of them, were pushing the idea that the risk of a zoonotic spillover event causing a major and highly destructive pandemic was so great that we had to risk this. Now, if they themselves have caused it, and if they are wrong, as I believe they are, about the likelihood of a major world pandemic spilling out of nature in the way that they wrote into their grant applications, then the danger is, the call is coming from inside the house.
Like, that is a broader point that needs to be addressed rather than the specificity of this case. So you're doing this baby bathwater situation where you're saying, okay, you can't discuss this even as a hypothesis, but at base, there is a 100% certainty that things of this nature are being carried on all over the country by various governments. And you could easily make the case as something that's a good thing. If you bioengineer one, you can reverse engineer it, maybe cure diseases. It doesn't have to be nefarious. But what is nefarious is to kind of arbitrarily, as Mark Zuckerberg or as Dr. Fauci.
Anthony Fauci, the hero of the pandemic, is the most important person in the world of gain-of-function research there is. He is the one dispersing all of the grants for this. He is the one who pushed to turn it back on after Obama turned it back off. That's a whole nother crazy story.
Who's one individual, draw the line and say, not only can you not discuss this, if you do discuss this, this is going to have great personal consequences for you.
There are commenters on the right, on Fox News and stuff, who are saying people shouldn't get vaccinated. I legitimately believe you could make a decent argument for arresting people who engage in that behavior.
By demonizing people like me, like Josh Rogan, like Yuri Dagan, the entire Drastic group on Twitter, by demonizing us for simply following the evidence is to set a terrible precedent. Right? You're demonizing people for using the scientific method to evaluate evidence that is available to us in the world. What a terrible crime it is to teach that lesson, right? Thou shalt not use scientific tools? No, I'm sorry. whatever your license to lie is, it doesn't extend to that.
Well, this is just a big billboard saying we don't know what the fuck we're doing, and we make arbitrary rules, and you get punished when they're wrong, even if you were right before we knew, and we can admit that we were wrong, but you don't get any sort of recompense or apology.
And at a certain point, you ask yourself, wait a minute, why was I ever under the belief that Jeremy Corbyn, Sir Keir, Nicola Sturgeon, Boris Johnson care about me or have my best interests at heart when they've never even met me or know I exist? And to expect powerful people to not be self-motivated or self-driven makes no sense.
In defense of the people who are worried about the quality of our information, the truth is we need institutions we can rely on, and it's pretty clear we don't quite have them. I mean, the FDA, the WHO, the CDC, all of them have at various moments covered themselves in embarrassment in the last 18 months. So, that's, again, there's a rational way to understand that, and then there's the paranoid way to exaggerate the nature of that problem. But exactly. We do need a rebooting of our institutions here, and there's no question.
I don't know exactly what force captured the institutions. I don't think anybody knows for sure out here in public. I don't even know that it wasn't just simply a process. But you have these institutions. They are behaving towards a kind of somatic obligation. They have lost sight of what they were built to accomplish. And on the inside, the way they avoid going back to their original mission is to say things to themselves like, the public can't have this discussion, it can't be trusted with it. Yes, we need to be able to talk about this, but it has to be private. Whatever it is they say to themselves, that is what capture sounds like on the inside. It's a institutional rationalization mechanism, and it's very, very deadly. And at the point you go from lab leak to repurposed drugs, you can see that it's very deadly in a very direct way.
That's an enormous amount of power for people to have, and to assume that this power is being used reasonably or objectively has been demonstrated to be false.
Just to show that they don't have capacity. These people aren't the clairvoyant, all-seeing eye that they really need to be. The only way that you would be able to deploy this sort of a rule is if you were omnipotent and you knew, I know all of the facts and I can make the most educated decision.
I'm torn even here. I don't know what YouTube and Facebook and all of these companies should be doing. I mean, there's certainly a straightforward argument that they should be censoring what is obviously misinformation. But the problem here is that, many things that were wrong yesterday are considered good information today, right? I mean, it's like they're very unlikely to get censorship right. What is outlier thinking and can be deemed dangerous or irresponsible can, in the fullness of time, prove to be the only correct view. So it's just a difficult problem that they show no sign of being able to solve.
Arrogant and stupid as they have become inside these corporations, if people look at what we've just said, they'll say, that's not what we're doing. We're saving lives. You guys are the ones jeopardizing lives.
Of course that's not what they think, but let's turn it on them, because that is effectively what they're doing.
I 100% agree. But my point is, they are in a position, if they want to check this, to find out that they are the villain in this story.
Yes.
Right? They need to check. They need to do what we've done. And when they see the evidence, when they see that people can obviously understand the value of this drug, that it is potentially life-saving, right? That they are obligated to say, how did we get here? How did we end up as the people shutting down doctors who have a useful therapy against a pandemic that has crippled planet Earth? How did we end up in that role?
So, if you were YouTube, who are exceptionally profitable and exceptionally powerful in terms of controlling what people get to see or not, what would you do? Would you take a stand, a public stand against the WHO, WHO, CDC? Or would you instead say, you know what, let's open the dam and let any video on anything fly? What do you do here? If if Bret Weinstein was put in charge of YouTube for a month in this most critical of times, where YouTube actually has incredible amounts of power to educate the populace to give power of knowledge to the populace such that they can reform institutions, what would you do? How would you run YouTube?
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, this is actually quite simple. If I were running YouTube, the limit of what should be allowed is the limit of the law, right? If what you are doing is legal, then it should not be YouTube's place to limit what gets said or who gets to hear it.
What can we do apart from just attack the big tech platforms for their crappy decisions? What could a better system look like? For example, could all the people who have large platforms and want to bring in some ethical standards and look into controversial topics like ivermectin come up with a code of conduct that we could all sign up to? Could we get some strength in numbers? What would a decentralized solution look like?
Let me mention 5 of the categories of solutions: masks, at-home testing, anonymized contact tracing, antiviral drugs, and vaccines. Within each of these categories, institutional leaders should have constantly asked and answered publicly, honestly, the following 3 questions. 1, what data do we have on the solution, and what studies are we running to get more and better data? 2, given the current data and uncertainty, how effective and how safe is the solution? 3, what is the timeline and cost involved with mass manufacture and distribution of the solution? In the service of these questions, no voices should have been silenced, no ideas left off the table. Open data, open science, open, honest scientific communication and debate was the way, not censorship. There are a lot of ideas out there that are bad, wrong, dangerous. But the moment we have the hubris to say we know which ideas those are is the moment we'll lose our ability to find the truth, to find solutions, the very things that make science beautiful and powerful.